Okay, OCD. We're all very familiar with OCD. I'm assuming from the DSM kind of descriptions of OCD as you see here, these are kind of our standard criteria for obsessions and for compulsions, right? Obsessions being the cognitive component, compulsions being the reaction to that cognitive component. And here's our standard model for OCD, right? So we've got our trigger. Let's pick a trigger that my favorite trigger to harp upon is a bump in the road. Right, I'm driving and I hit a bump in the road. So that bump is a nice kind of trigger. That triggers what? A thought. Right now it's just a thought like, what if I hit someone? Right, great thought to have. So what if I hit somebody? Well, you can have that thought, but then you might say to yourself, nah, that was silly. That's just not gonna happen. Done, problem solved, right? Nah, there'd be blood all over the windshield, right? This is not gonna, no, right? Or you could say something like, oh my God, this is actually serious. What if I did that? Right? You have a cognitive fusion. Your thought is reality. Okay? So we might have a situation where somebody's thoughts, they experience them as real. Oh my gosh, I could have done this. Right? Just for a brief instant. We're not talking about like they don't have to ruminate, they dwell on it. And their anxiety goes up as a result of not the thought. I can think right now as much as I want about an asteroid crushing us, right? A giant fiery ball of death plummeting down, but I don't feel any anxiety about that. Because it's just a thought, right? It's not my reality, okay? So the thought has to have some experience of reality to it. It has to be appraised as something that has some possibility there for me to experiencing that anxiety, because my mind doesn't differentiate at that point the fantasy from reality. It's identified as reality, even partly so. And then I do one of three things. I either check, let's say, what if I hit somebody? Maybe I pull over and check, right? It's not a compulsion yet. It only becomes a compulsion when we repeat this cycle over and over again. First time I check, and then my anxiety goes down, right? Okay. Or, I might do something else superstitious. I don't check, but I say, please God, please God, please God. And then my anxiety goes down. Right? The next time I hit a bump in the road, I think to myself again, right? Because now this has been negatively reinforced. And, I think it again, my anxiety goes up, and I do one of those behaviors. At some point, I stop even doing those behaviors maybe, and I start to also avoid the situations. I drive only on certain roads and not on other roads because of the potential of getting a bump, okay? Which means the potential of hitting somebody. And then I avoid driving altogether, for example. But then I might avoid being in a bus or in somebody else's car, right? Or I start to get the same thoughts when I'm in somebody else's car. So we create this cycle of obsessions, which is that perseveration on these thoughts, and compulsions, okay? So what's really important to differentiate, we'll talk about how we differentiate the few in this model versus autism, is that there's a functional link between obsessions and compulsions, right? Where compulsions serve to reduce the anxiety that comes about from the obsession, okay? The negative affect that comes about from the obsession, okay? So you ask yourself, in autism, do the obsessions that they have cause the anxiety, or is it the absence of the obsession that causes the anxiety? Right? And this is an important kind of differentiating feature. If I am anxious when I don't engage in discussions of plumbing, or if I don't have my red blankie with me, right, then that's part of my ASD. I like having this red blanket. It feels good. I like talking about my obsessions, my thoughts here, right? The things that I'm focused on. I have obsessions, but they're not the obsessions in OCD, right? OCD happens that when I'm talking about that, I'm feeling anxious, not when I'm not talking about it, okay? You guys see that difference? That's the difference between an ego dystonic and an ego syntonic experience. Now, clearly, if somebody is able to articulate their experience, they might say, I don't know why I'm still thinking about this. I don't want to keep thinking about this, and I have no choice. It just keeps popping into my head. Okay, then it's quite clear. Right? That's like your typical manifestation of the obsessions. But even if it's not the case, you can differentiate because of this presence-absence kind of test. Are they restricted interests or are they obsessions? Okay? The obsessions in OCD are things that give rise to distress. They might not be articulated as anxiety, But at some point, the obsession itself gives rise to the negative affect. And then the behavior that follows rectifies that negative affect. So sometimes it might be anger. You might see it atypically, like the obsession gives rise to anger. And then the behavioral compulsion reduces that anger. But they're thinking, they're dwelling, they're perseverating on on the thought, whatever it is. Okay? Usually a restricted interest, even though it's restricted, is actually satisfying their needs. That's not the obsessions in OCD. Okay? Does the obsession bother the person at all? Now, there is a group of people with OCD, without autism, who show what we call low insight, right? Now, when you have low insight, at some point, you feel like it's functional to obsess. You feel like it's okay to. It's a subgroup that you could say, well, don't you see that you're worrying in this way and that's why you're anxious, you keep focusing. No, the reason why I haven't run anybody over is because I keep checking. I have to keep focusing on this or else. You're the one who's wrong for asking me to stop thinking about this. So there is that group, and clearly that's a harder group to differentiate. But for the most part, people don't want to be thinking about germs. Right? And it comes into their mind. Okay? Now, just not right OCD versus behavioral. So there is a group also in OCD, the ones with low insight, who can't articulate what their obsessions are. So they just feel uncomfortable when things aren't the way they're supposed to be, the way they've designed it to be. They've created their environment to be one big reassurance signal, one big safety signal, and when that's violated, they experience a need to do a compulsion to rectify the situation. Okay? That group clearly, that might look a lot like ASD. Okay, that two component. So this can happen in both. If there's a deviation in routines or a constant need for sameness, you can see that, and that might look very much like the just not right OCD. So one thing to keep in mind or try to ask yourself is, are there behavioral rigidities also present in addition? So not just keeping my environment a certain way, but in the more kind of bottom-up processes, the ways that I walk or the ways that I talk, the ways that I like to move or express myself in space, right? That's not typical part of this low insight OCD, okay, which is much more about controlling the environment and controlling my routines. Okay? Again, another piece is that there has to be anxiety related to that and a compulsive component. So repetitive behaviors versus compulsions. Right? So compulsions are defined by relation to the obsessions. If somebody has perseverative behaviors, repetitive behaviors, but it's not a response to negative affectivity, it's not a compulsion in the OCD sense, right? It's part of their ASD. If it comes as a result of the experience of anxiety, and really because of that anxiety as a way to reduce, then it is a compulsion. Any questions about that? I kind of went through that part quickly on OCD, but it's very important to distinguish because the treatment for one, as I said, is going to be different than the treatment for the other.